Peter Pan is a book with dynamic energy. One starry night, Peter Pan and Tinkerbell led their three darling children, over the rooftops of London and away to Neverland, the island where lost boys play, mermaids splash, and fairies make mischief. We pick up on the second chapter after the darlings have found out that their children are gone. Mrs. Darling screamed, and as if in an answer to a bell, the door opened and Nana entered. Returned from her evening out, she growled and sprang at the boy, who leaped through the window. Again, Mrs. Darling screamed, this time in distress for him, for she thought he was killed. She ran down into the street to look for his little body, but it was not there. And she looked up in the black night, and she could see nothing but what she thought was a shooting star. She returned to the nursery and found Nana with something in her mouth, which proved to be the boy's shadow. As he leapt at the window, Nana had closed it quickly, too late to catch him. But his shadow had not had time to get out. Slam went the window and snapped it off. You may be sure Mrs. Darling examined the shadow carefully, but it was quite the ordinary kind. Nana had no doubt of what was the best thing to do with the shadow. She hung it out the window, meaning he is sure to come back for it. Let us put it where he can get it easily, without disturbing the children. But unfortunately, Mrs. Darling could not leave it hanging out at the window. It looked so like the washing and lowered the whole tone of the house. She thought of showing it to Mr. Darling, but he was totting up winter gray coats for John and Michael, and with a wet towel wrapped around his head to keep his brain clear, and seemed ashamed to trouble him. Besides, she knew exactly what he would say. It all comes to having a dog for a nurse. She decided to roll the shadow up and put it away carefully in a drawer until a fitting opportunity came for telling her husband. Ah, me. The opportunity came a week later, on that never-to-be-forgotten Friday. Of course it was Friday. I ought to have been specially careful on a Friday, she used to say afterwards to her husband, while perhaps Nana was on the other side of her, holding her hand. No, no, Mr. Darling always said. I am responsible for it. I, George Darling, did it. Mea culpa, mea culpa. He had a classical education. They sat thus night after night, recalling that fateful Friday, till every detail was stamped on their brains and came through like the other side their faces on a bad coinage. If only I had not accepted that invitation to dine at 27, Mrs. Darling would say. If only I had not poured my medicine into Nana's bowl, said Mr. Darling. If only I had pretended to like the medicine, was what Nana's wet eyes said. My liking for parties, George. My fatal gift for humor, dearest. My toughness in trifles, dear master and mistress. Then one or more of them would break down, all together. Nana, the throw. It's true, they ought not to have a dog for a nurse. Many a time it was Mr. Darling who put the handkerchief to Nana's eyes. That fiend, Mr. Darling would cry, and Nana's bark was the echo of it. But Mrs. Darling never upbraided Peter. There was something in the right corner of her mouth that wanted her not to call Peter names. They would sit there in the empty nursery, recalling fondly every smallest detail of that dreadful evening. It had begun so uneventfully, so precisely like hundreds of other evenings, with Nana putting the water for Michael's bath and carrying him too on her back. I won't go to bed, he shouted, like one who still believed that he had the last word on the subject. I won't! I won't! Nana, isn't it 6 o'clock yet? Oh dear, I shan't love you any more, Nana. I tell you, I won't be bathed. I won't, I won't! Then Mrs. Darling had come in, wearing her white evening gown. She had dressed early because Wendy so loved to see her in her evening gown, and with the necklace George gave her. She was wearing Wendy's bracelet on her arm. She had asked for the loan of it. Wendy so loved to lend her bracelet to her mother. She found her 2 children playing and being herself and father on occasion of Wendy's birth. And John was saying, I am happy to inform you, Mrs. Darling, that you are now a mother, in just such a tone as Mr. Darling himself may have used on that real occasion. Wendy had danced with joy, as the real Mrs. Darling must have done. Then John was born, with extra pomp that he was conceived due to the birth of a male, and Michael came from his bath to ask to be born also. But John said brutally that they did not want any more. Michael had nearly cried. Nobody wants me, he said. And of course the lady in evening dress could not stand that. I do, she said. I so want a 3rd child. Boy or a girl? Asked Michael, not too hopeful. Boy. Then he leapt into her arms. Such a little thing for Mr. and Mrs. Darling and Nana to recall now, but not so little if that was to be Michael's last night in the nursery. They go on with their recollections. It was then that I rushed in like a tornado, wasn't it? Mr. Darling would say, scorning himself. And indeed, he had been like a tornado. Perhaps there was some excuse for him. He too had begun dressing for the party, and all had gone well with him until it came to his tie. It is an outstanding thing to have to tell, but this man, though he knew about stocks and shares, had no really mastery of his tie. Sometimes the thing yielded to him without a contest, but there were occasions when it would have been better for the house if he had swallowed his pride and used a made-up tie. This was such an occasion. He came rushing into the nursery with a crumpled little brute of a tie in his hand. Why, what is the matter, Father dear? Matter? He yelled. He really yelled. This tie, it will not tie. He became dangerously sarcastic. Not round my neck, round the bedpost. Oh yes, 20 times I made it up around the bedpost. But my neck, no. Oh no. Begs to be excused. He thought Mrs. Darling was not sufficiently impressed.